Imagine living every day only miles from total annihilation. For the residents of Seoul, that is daily life. The threat from the north means the city could vanish in an instant. And that's only the beginning. If Seoul were destroyed, the world would be forced to react, and the fallout would spread beyond the Korean peninsula. But what would actually happen? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we'll show the fallout if North Korea drops the bomb on Seoul. Kim Jong-un has spent the last decade collecting automatic weapons like their Pokemon cards. Intelligence estimates put his arsenal at around 50 to 60 warheads. That doesn't sound like a lot until you realize that is way more destructive power than what flattened Hiroshima. North Korea has spent about $1.6 billion on its nuclear program over the past 50 years. That money could have bought over 5 million Big Macs at US prices, enough for Kim to give every citizen a burger a week for decades. Or for the same price, he could have picked up around 1,600 Rolls-Royce Phantoms, which probably would have been more on brand. The delivery system matters too. North Korea's Hwasong-15 ICBM can theoretically reach Washington, D.C., but for Seoul, that's no problem. The 35-mile distance means he's got options: short-range missiles, medium-range missiles, or even just driving the thing over in a really suspicious-looking van. Now let's get to the physics. A 100-kiloton nuclear warhead, which is a reasonable estimate for what North Korea might toss Seoul's way, packs the punch of more than 6 Hiroshimas. Dropped over New York, something that big would inflict over 500,000 casualties almost immediately. That's because when it detonates, it creates a fireball that reaches over 180 million degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, that's more than 5 times hotter than the core of the sun. The weapon delivers death in a horrifying triple threat. First comes the thermal pulse, a flash of heat so intense that everything within 2 miles spontaneously combusts. And then comes the blast wave, traveling at 750 miles per hour and packing enough overpressure to flatten buildings. And finally, there's radiation, the gift that keeps on giving. It turns survivors into walking casualties who will be fighting cancer for decades. Seoul's geography makes this nightmare scenario even worse. The metro area is home to over 25 million people. The city itself packs 41,000 people into 1 square mile, which means that more people live in the greater Seoul capital area than in all of Australia. So let's just say that Kim dropped a nuke on Myeongdong, Seoul's Times Square equivalent. He'd be targeting one of the densest urban areas on the planet. Fortunately for Kim, this dartboard is made entirely of bullseyes. On any weekday, the area would be packed. Office workers at their desks, students pretending to pay attention in class, and families going about their lives. The first thing wouldn't be the explosion. It would be every piece of modern technology suddenly shutting down. The electromagnetic pulse hits at the speed of light, which means that your smartphone dies before your brain even registers the flash. Every car, computer, traffic light, ATM, and Wi-Fi router in a 20-mile radius just became very expensive paperweights. Suddenly, Seoul's famous hyperconnected society has been sent back to the Middle Ages. Want to know how bad an EMP can really get? It turns out the US tried it in 1962, and it was a really bad idea. The electromagnetic pulse from the 1.4 megaton nuke, launched 250 miles into space, still had enough juice to deactivate 300 streetlights, wipe ongoing phone calls, and damage electronics in Hawaii 900 miles away. It also brought down 6 space satellites. Thermal radiation also travels fast, which creates one of nuclear war's most horrifying calling cards: human shadows burned permanently into concrete. We know this too, sadly, from first-hand experience. At Hiroshima, people's bodies absorbed so much thermal energy that they left perfect silhouettes on walls and sidewalks. 15 seconds later, the shock wave arrives, and this is where Seoul's urban density becomes a death sentence. The blast wave hits with 35 pounds per square inch of overpressure, which is like a 300-mile-per-hour hurricane made entirely of concrete and bad intentions. To put that into perspective, a Category 5 hurricane tops out at around 157 miles per hour, and it's made comparatively of gentle air. This is 2 times faster and infinitely angrier. The math gets ugly fast. Within the immediate blast radius, concrete buildings turn to dust. The Lotte World Tower, Seoul's crown jewel at just over 1,800 feet tall, faces forces it was never designed to handle. Modern skyscrapers can sway in earthquakes and flex in typhoons, but nuclear shockwaves don't negotiate. Steel beams twist into spaghetti. Glass windows are horizontal blizzards of razor-sharp death traveling at hundreds of miles per hour. Seoul's subway system, normally a lifeline for 8 million daily riders, is a lottery of life and death. Stations close to the surface collapse. The deeper stations suddenly become the most valuable real estate in Korea. Depth equals survival, and every meter underground is worth about 10,000 years of life expectancy. Things go absolutely medieval at T plus 30 to 60 seconds. By then, the entire city is a giant furnace. The thermal pulse ignites everything flammable within 2 miles. At this point, Seoul is in the grip of a firestorm, buildings burning, oxygen consumed, and a vacuum pulling even more air into the inferno. It's about this stage when the Han River, normally a scenic backdrop for romantic dates and riverside cafes, actually starts boiling. Not metaphorically either, literally. The iconic bridges that connect Seoul's districts collapse into the steaming water, cutting the city into isolated islands of destruction. Within a minute, the death toll hits around 300,000 people dead. Another 500,000 are critically injured. Put that into perspective, it's almost as many casualties in 1 minute than the entire U.S. military suffered during World War II. It's also roughly equivalent to the entire population of Fort Worth, Texas, killed or wounded in the time it takes to microwave a burrito. And that's just the opening credits. The terrifying main feature hasn't even begun. If the first minute wasn't bad enough, the first hour is really where reality sets in. This is when a modern metropolis discovers that all those systems holding society together are about as sturdy as a house of cards. The first domino to fall is probably the most crucial. Seoul National University Hospital, normally the crown jewel of Korean healthcare, is at the center of a catastrophe. The hospital has around 1,700 beds, but 500,000 critically injured people are heading their way. That is one hospital bed for every 294 people who desperately need one. Even worse, medical staff are caught up in the blast. They're either dead, missing, or injured. Doctors work with equipment that has either been fried by the EMP or melted by the heat. Radiation sickness adds its own special flavor of horror to the mix. The movies make you think that radiation poisoning makes you glow green or gives you superpowers, but really, it makes your cells forget how to behave properly. Within hours, people experience what doctors call acute radiation syndrome, which includes vomiting, diarrhea, and your immune system basically rage-quitting. Imagine having the worst flu of your life except your body is slowly dissolving from the inside out at the same time. That's what it's like. Seoul's transportation network is a monument to twisted metal and shattered dreams. Incheon Airport, which handles 70 million passengers annually, becomes a very expensive glassed-over parking lot for planes that will never fly again. Seoul Station, which usually processes 100,000 commuters daily, is in rubble. Remember Seoul's vaunted subway system? Its stations become underground mausoleums or humanity's last hope, depending on how deep they are. The city that gave the world Samsung smartphones is cut off. The only people still talking to the outside world are amateur radio operators, suddenly promoted from hobbyists to civilization's last lifeline. These are the folks who normally spend their weekends chatting with strangers in Nebraska about the weather, and now they coordinate international disaster relief. What about Seoul's economic pulse? The Seoul Stock Exchange. The Seoul Stock Exchange normally buzzes with over $2 trillion in market value. Moments after the blast, it suffers what economists might call politely total liquidity evaporation. Samsung's headquarters are a radioactive crater. The world's 13th largest economy grinds to a halt, and the global financial system feels the shockwaves. The Korean won hits worthless paper status, something not seen at this scale since wheelbarrows of cash were burned for warmth in Weimar, Germany. By hour 2, news of the blast spreads to those somehow spared from its immediate ravages. It kicks off a great Korean exodus. Every highway becomes a parking lot, every gas station a battleground for the last drops of civilization. Millions attempt to flee at once. Imagine the vast majority of Texans suddenly evacuating, but now shrink Texas to the size of a city and funnel every highway onto one road heading south. Traditional travel is futile. Within hours, highways become rivers of abandoned vehicles. If caught in the winds, the radiation plume moves at a speed of 15 miles per hour. Now that might sound slow, but for people trapped in gridlock, it's a disaster in motion. If you can't outrun your own shadow, you definitely can't outrun a blanket of invisible death particles, each with a 30-year half-life. Busan, normally a 4 to 5 hour drive from Seoul, receives its first taste of radioactive fallout within 24 hours. The southern coastal city, which probably thought it was far enough away to be safe, discovers that fallout doesn't respect city limits or wishful thinking. Meanwhile, 30,000 feet above the chaos, commercial aviation is in crisis. Planes carrying hundreds of passengers on approach to Incheon Airport have nowhere to land. Air traffic controllers are dead or evacuated, radar systems fried, and the runways are glass. Where do they go? They can't go north. Airports across Asia play the world's most expensive game of musical chairs. The skies fill with aerial refugees, burning fuel while circling over the Pacific. Countries immediately close airspace to Korean flights. In the middle of this chaos, first responders face an impossible choice: help people and die from radiation exposure, or stay safe and watch people die from everything else. International aid offers pour in within hours, but there is one small problem. Radiation levels are so high that rescue operations are basically death runs. It's the ultimate catch-22 of disaster relief. The people who need the help the most are in places too dangerous for aid to reach. The aftermath's military dimension kicks into overdrive over the next 3 days. It's the world's worst wake-up call for South Korea's 450,000 active military personnel. One moment, they're running routine exercises and complaining about mess hall food along the DMZ, and then the next, they face a scenario that eclipses everything they've ever trained for. Suddenly, the DMZ, normally the most dangerous place in Korea, is the safest spot on the peninsula. The problem for the South Korean military isn't just that Seoul is its capital, it's also its brain. Command and control structures that took decades to build are erased in 60 seconds. Suddenly, generals are forced to make decisions using scraps of information from amateur radio operators. Without a doubt, the 28,500 U.S. troops stationed in South Korea find themselves in the most awkward and harrowing position imaginable. Camp Humphreys, usually a comfortable posting where the biggest danger is bad cafeteria food, now just sits 40 miles from a nuclear crater. And nobody remembers what their basic training manual said about fallout patterns because, well, they don't mention them at all. The U.S. 7th Fleet, usually cruising somewhere in the Pacific with enough nuclear firepower to delete small countries, faces the dreaded "now what" question. Nuclear submarines loaded with Trident missiles receive coded messages that ask their operators to stand by. Meanwhile, America's leadership is figuring out if World War III is about to start. The ethical question now gets extremely heavy for American military planners. How do you respond proportionally to a nuclear attack? Drop one nuke back? 10? Turn North Korea into a glowing parking lot? The Pentagon's response options range from overwhelming conventional force to mutually assured destruction, with a stop at surgical nuclear strike. The problem is that nuclear doctrine was designed for superpowers playing chess with civilization, not for regional conflicts. NATO is the geopolitical equivalent of a logic puzzle from hell. South Korea isn't a NATO member, but the United States is, and the US just watched its ally get nuked. Article 5, NATO's famous attack on one is an attack on all clause, wasn't designed for this scenario, and everyone knows it. That doesn't stop European leaders from frantically checking maps to remember just exactly how far Korea is from Europe. China is dragged into the mire, facing its most awkward geopolitical dilemma in modern history. Its unstable ally just nuked its largest regional trading partner. Beijing's border with North Korea would suddenly become a radioactive fence line. The People's Liberation Army mobilizes, with nobody knowing if they're containing North Korea, protecting China, or preparing to invade everyone else. Russia's nuclear doctrine suddenly matters in ways it hasn't since the Cold War. In Moscow, analysts frantically calculate whether this regional conflict spirals into a global nuclear exchange. Then, the mother of all market crashes comes. The Dow Jones, FTSE, Nikkei, and every other major index plummet in the first hour of trading. $30 trillion in global market value is wiped out. Oil prices spike to $200 a barrel as traders realize major shipping lanes near Korea are now radioactive obstacle courses. Korean waters, normally bustling with cargo ships carrying everything from cars to K-pop merchandise, become no-go zones. Seoul and its surrounding area becomes a Korean Chernobyl, complete with a 20-mile exclusion zone with a radioactive half-life of 30 years. Survivors' grandchildren inherit radiation levels still half as deadly as today's. Great-grandchildren will get a quarter-strength dose, and great-great-grandchildren face levels that still slightly increase cancer risk. Cancer rates across the region rise dramatically over the next 5 to 7 years, with leukemia leading the charge. Children are especially vulnerable because their rapidly dividing cells are like radiation magnets. Thyroid cancer rates skyrocket, birth defects spike, cataracts, sterility, immune system disorders become epidemic. The mental health crisis dwarfs the physical one. North Korea is once again friendless. Arms control treaties, painstakingly negotiated over decades, crumble faster than Seoul's skyline. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is as binding as a suggestion box, and every country with a nuclear engineering program gets very interested in peaceful atomic energy that suspiciously looks like weapons development. Within 72 hours, the world faces what military strategists call escalation dominance, the point where doing nothing becomes as dangerous as doing everything. The US and South Korea would likely choose an overwhelming conventional response over nuclear retaliation, launching massive airstrikes that flatten North Korea's military infrastructure. But here's the rub. North Korea still has 50-plus nuclear warheads, and Kim Jong-un has nothing to lose. Cornered dictators with doomsday weapons don't go quietly. The most likely scenario is Kim launching everything he has left at South Korea, Japan, and US bases in the Pacific. This triggers the nightmare scenario with multiple nuclear detonations across the Pacific Rim. The US goes into full nuclear response, while China and Russia face impossible calculations about whether this regional conflict justifies a response. The most probable outcome isn't World War III, but something arguably worse: a conventional war that lasts 72 hours, yet leaves the Korean peninsula uninhabitable for 30 years. It triggers a nuclear arms race across Asia and proves nuclear weapons aren't just for threatening anymore. Military doctrine worldwide is rewritten overnight. Missile defense systems, previously considered expensive insurance policies, become the most important infrastructure projects on Earth. Military budgets worldwide surge as countries realize that deterrence only works if everyone agrees to be deterred. When someone breaks the mutual understanding that nuclear weapons are for threatening, not using, the balance collapses. Suddenly, every military planner needs new playbooks for a world where the unthinkable becomes routine. The cascading effects reveal how interconnected our modern world really is. Seoul's destruction doesn't stay in Seoul. It crashes markets in New York, grounds flights in Tokyo, triggers military alerts in Moscow, and reshapes nuclear policy in every capital on the Earth. It's like pulling one thread and watching the entire fabric of international order unravel. In nuclear war, there are no winners, only degrees of losing. The only victory is making sure the game never gets played.